Floor 13 doesn't exist. Every building I've ever lived in that has an elevator skips the 13th floor. The same tired superstition you've probably seen 100 times without thinking twice about it. The buttons go straight from 12 to 14. And everybody understands, without needing to be told, that floor 14 is really floor 13, wearing a different number so nobody has to feel bad about it. I lived in a building like that for 2 years without giving it a second thought. Then, on a Tuesday night in March, I want to back up and give you a fuller picture of the 2 years I lived at the Aldermore before that Tuesday night, because I think the ordinariness of that time matters as much as anything that happened afterward. I moved in during a lease special, a modest discount for signing a longer term in a building that had nothing outwardly strange about it at all. A doorman who worked mornings only, a small fitness room in the basement that smelled permanently of old rubber mats, a rooftop deck residence used for barbecues in the summer. I want you to understand that I loved living there in the unremarkable way you love any decent apartment in a decent building, and that nothing about those 2 years gave me any reason to think about that missing 13th floor as anything other than a mildly amusing quirk of the building's numbering scheme. I'd actually joked about it once, early on, with a neighbor on my floor named Harriet, an older woman who'd lived in the building for almost 15 years and who I occasionally shared an elevator ride with on our way out in the mornings. I'd made some offhand comment about how silly it was that grown adults still needed buildings to pretend a number didn't exist, expecting her to laugh along the way most people do at that kind of comment. She hadn't laughed. She'd gone quiet for a moment, in a way I registered at the time but didn't think much of, and then said, carefully, "It's not really about superstition in this building. I'd just leave it alone if I were you." Before the elevator reached the lobby, and the conversation moved naturally onto something else, I filed that exchange away without examining it closely, the way you file away 100 small, odd comments over the course of ordinary life, most of which never turn out to mean anything at all. I think about it constantly now, turning it over, the way you'd turn over a piece of evidence you'd once dismissed as irrelevant, trying to extract every last bit of meaning from 5 careful words that I now understand were the closest thing to a direct warning I ever received before that Tuesday night. I got into the elevator, on the ground floor, alone, pressed the button for my floor, and watched the number for the button light up as 13 instead of 14. A button that, as far as I have ever been able to determine, from a full year of investigation afterward, does not exist anywhere in that elevator's actual wiring, and never has. My name is Priya Nair. No relation to anyone in any story you might have heard before this one. It's simply a common name, and I mention it only because I want to be as plainly identifiable and accountable for this account as I can be, given how much of it sounds, even to me, like something I invented. I lived in the Aldermore, a 14-story apartment building downtown, from 2022 until this past spring, in a 1-bedroom on the 9th floor that I chose specifically because it was affordable, well located, and, as far as I could tell during my initial tour, completely unremarkable in every way that matters to an ordinary renter. The building had the standard elevator configuration you'll find in most mid-rise buildings of a certain age: 2 elevator cars, buttons numbered 1 through 12, then straight to 14, the number 13 simply absent, folded out of existence, the way it always is in buildings built by superstitious developers or superstitious tenants who complained enough to get the numbering changed after the fact. I'd ridden that elevator thousands of times over 2 years without incident. And I want to be clear about that baseline normalcy, because it's important for understanding just how wrong that Tuesday night in March actually was. I'd worked late, later than usual, coming home a little after 11 from a deadline that had eaten most of my evening. Tired in the specific, hollowed-out way that comes from too many hours staring at a screen, thinking about nothing more complicated than the leftovers waiting in my fridge. I got into the elevator alone, which wasn't unusual for that hour, and I pressed the button for the 9th floor the way I'd done 1,000 times before. And it was only once the doors had already closed, once the car had already begun to rise, that I glanced down at the button panel and noticed, with a slow, creeping wrongness that took several full seconds to fully register, that the button directly above the one for the 12th floor, which had always simply been absent. A smooth, unbroken stretch of metal panel where a 13th floor button should have been and never was, now had a button, illuminated, labeled in the same worn, decades-old font as every other button on that panel. 13. I want to be honest that my first reaction wasn't fear. It was confusion, the mundane, practical confusion of someone assuming a maintenance change had happened without her noticing, new panel installed, numbering scheme corrected, some building management decision made and implemented without any of the usual notices taped to the lobby bulletin board. I actually reached out and touched it, out of nothing more than idle curiosity, and I want you to understand that this single, small, unthinking action is the one I have replayed more than any other moment in this entire story, turning it over with a kind of retroactive dread that has never fully faded. Because the moment my finger made contact with that button, the elevator lurched hard, the kind of sudden mechanical jolt you feel in your stomach, and the floor indicator display above the door, which had been steadily climbing, 6, 7, 8, stopped, flickered, and reset to a single, glowing number. 13. The elevator had not, as far as I could tell from the motion and the sound, actually stopped moving. It had simply started displaying a floor that, as far as I understood the building's actual construction, did not exist between the 12th and 14th floors at all. There was no physical gap in the building's height that would have accommodated a genuine, unlabeled floor. Nothing in the exterior architecture that suggested any missing or hidden level. And yet the doors, after another few seconds of the car continuing to rise or perhaps simply continuing to move in some direction I couldn't identify, opened. I did not get out immediately. I want that on the record because I think the fact that I hesitated, that some old animal instinct held me rooted in place for several long seconds before curiosity finally won out over caution, is the only reason I'm able to tell you this story at all rather than becoming another entry in whatever ledger tracks the people who don't hesitate long enough. The hallway beyond those doors looked, at first glance, almost exactly like every other floor in that building. The same worn carpet, the same cream-colored walls, the same evenly spaced doors leading to apartments I assumed mirrored the layout of my own floor below. But the lighting was wrong in a way I struggled to articulate even to myself in the moment. Dimmer than it should have been, with a faint, sickly yellow cast that made the whole hallway look like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long. Colors bleeding slightly at their edges. And the air, the instant the doors opened, carried a cold that had nothing to do with any air conditioning system. A cold with the same specific heavy quality I would later hear described in an online forum for people who'd experienced things they couldn't otherwise explain as the kind of cold that has a shape to it, like something is standing close enough to touch you. I stepped back, hit the button for the lobby with a hand that had started visibly to shake, and the doors closed, and the elevator resumed its climb as though nothing at all had happened, delivering me to the actual 9th floor a few seconds later, with a soft, ordinary chime, the number 13 button gone from the panel as completely as if it had never existed. Smooth, unbroken metal where I had, moments before, felt an actual physical button beneath my fingertip. I went to see Harriet the very next evening, still shaken enough from the night before that I didn't bother easing into the subject the way I might normally have with a neighbor I knew only casually. I told her everything, the button, the lurch, the dim hallway, the cold with a shape to it. And I watched her face move through an entire sequence of reactions before she finally sighed, sat down heavily in her armchair, and gestured for me to sit as well. I wondered if it would eventually happen to you, she said. It doesn't happen to everyone. I've lived here 15 years and it's only happened to me once, early on, my 3rd year in the building. I made the same mistake you did. I touched the button out of simple curiosity, and the doors opened, and I did what you did. I stepped back and hit the lobby button as fast as I could. I never told building management. I don't think there'd be any point. I don't think they don't know. I think they've simply decided, the same way I eventually decided, that the safest thing to do is act like it isn't there and hope it stays that way. She told me that evening the fuller version of what she understood about the building's history. Details she said she'd pieced together herself over years of careful, quiet research, motivated by the same need I was now feeling to understand what she'd actually experienced. The Aldermore, she said, had been built on the site of an earlier building, a considerably older apartment structure that had burned down in 1936. A fire that killed. According to a newspaper clipping she still kept in a folder in her desk, at least 9 residents on what would have been, in that older building's own numbering scheme. Its 13th floor, a coincidence of numbering between 2 entirely separate buildings, built decades apart, that struck her, and now struck me, as considerably too precise to be coincidence at all. I think whatever's attached to that floor isn't attached to this specific building, she said. I think it's attached to whatever happened on that specific floor, in whichever building happens to occupy that footprint, going back to 1936 and probably further than that, if anyone had kept records going back further. I think the numbering avoidance in this building isn't really superstition at all. I think somebody who built the Aldermore knew exactly what had happened here before, and built the numbering scheme deliberately. The same careful, deliberate way people build any other safety feature into a structure, hoping it would be enough to keep residents from ever accidentally finding their way to something that was never actually gone. Just waiting for the right conditions to become accessible again. I did not sleep that night. I want to describe the specific quality of the fear I felt, lying awake in my own apartment, 4 floors below wherever I'd actually been. Because it wasn't primarily a fear of what I'd seen. The hallway itself, empty and dim and strange as it was, hadn't done anything overtly threatening. It was a fear built entirely out of the impossibility of what had happened. The specific horror of watching a fixed physical, mechanical system, a system I'd relied on without a second thought for 2 solid years, reveal that it was capable of something entirely outside its own design. Something that suggested the building itself contained more floors, more rooms, more space than its actual exterior dimensions could account for. I did what anyone in my position would eventually do. I researched the building's history, starting the very next morning, first through public records at the county assessor's office, and then, once that yielded frustratingly little, through the same kind of online forums and local history groups I'd once have dismissed as the territory of overactive imaginations, before I had direct personal reason to take them seriously. The Aldermore was built in 1974. The assessor's records confirmed as a 14-story residential building from the outset. No additions, no renovations that altered its height. Nothing in the permit history suggesting any hidden or later sealed flaw. But an old local history forum, maintained by a small dedicated group of residents interested in the city's architectural past, contained a thread, several years old by the time I found it, discussing a fire in the building in December of 1981 that had, according to a short article from the local paper's archive that someone had scanned and posted, killed 3 residents on what the article specifically identified as the 13th floor. Language that made no sense given the building's actual, official numbering scheme, unless the article's author had simply used the colloquial, common-sense number for what management insisted on calling the 14th floor. I want to tell you about the specific detail from that old newspaper article that convinced me this was more than simple confusion over informal floor numbering, because it's the detail that finally connected everything I'd experienced to something concrete and historical, rather than a random, inexplicable glitch in an old elevator. The article named the 3 residents who died in that fire, and included a small, grainy photograph of the building afterward, smoke damage visible around several windows on what would have been, using the building's actual physical construction, the 13th story counting from the ground. The same floor, in other words, that had been renumbered 14 on every button panel, every directory, every official document connected to that building, for the entire duration of its subsequent existence, in an apparent effort undertaken sometime between that fire and whatever renovation followed it, to simply erase the number from public memory rather than address whatever had actually happened there. I found one further thing, buried in a comment on that same forum thread, posted by someone using a handle that gave no indication of their real identity, describing an experience that mirrored my own so closely that reading it made my hands go cold on my own keyboard. This commenter claimed to have lived in the building in the late 1990s and described in careful, hesitant language, clearly written by someone who expected not to be believed, an elevator ride during which the panel had briefly displayed a button for the 13th floor, and during which they had, out of the same unthinking curiosity I'd felt myself, pressed it and been delivered to a dim, oddly colored hallway that smelled, they wrote, like smoke that had been trapped somewhere airtight for a very long time, still sharp, like it hadn't had anywhere to go in decades. This commenter had not stepped out into that hallway. They wrote that they'd hit the lobby button immediately, the way I had, and that the doors had closed on an image that has apparently stayed with them for the 20-some years since. A shape standing at the far end of that dim hallway, backlit by the sickly yellow light, too indistinct to make out any features, that had raised one arm, slowly, in what the commenter described as not a wave, not exactly, more like someone testing whether I'd wave back. I never contacted this commenter directly. The forum software offered no way to message anonymous posters, and by the time I found the thread, the account showed no activity for over 3 years. I don't know if they're still alive, still living in that city, or whether whatever they experienced ever escalated beyond that single incident. I know only that their account matched mine closely enough, in enough specific, unusual detail, that I no longer had any way to convince myself that what had happened to me was an isolated glitch, a trick of exhaustion, a hallucination born of a long work night and an overtired mind. I gave notice on my apartment less than a month later. I told my landlord it was for a job relocation, which wasn't true, and I never told anyone at the building management office what I'd actually experienced, partly because I doubted they'd believe me, and partly because some instinct, the same one that had kept me from stepping fully out of that elevator car, told me it was better not to draw any additional attention to a floor that the building's own official records had worked so hard, for over 40 years, to make sure nobody ever had reason to look for. I still think about the last detail from that anonymous forum comment, more than almost anything else from this entire experience. That raised arm, that slow, testing gesture, not a threat, not obviously malicious, just a shape in a dim hallway checking whether anyone still remembered how to wave back. I think about the 3 names in that 1981 newspaper article, and I wonder, more than I'd like to admit, whether whatever's still occupying that renumbered floor is aware of how much time has actually passed, or whether it exists in some suspended repeating version of December 1981 that only occasionally, unpredictably, intersects with the actual present-day building around it, catching whichever tired, unsuspecting resident happens to be riding alone, late at night when the numbers briefly line up. I did some of my own research after that conversation with Harriet, partly to corroborate what she'd told me, and partly because I've always been the kind of person who needs to see a document before fully trusting a second-hand account, however credible the source. The 1936 fire was real. I found it in the same digitized newspaper archive I'd later used to look into other buildings' histories. A short article reporting 9 confirmed deaths in a residential fire at the address that, cross-referencing old city maps, corresponded exactly to the Aldermore's current footprint. The article did not specify a floor number using the same 13th language Harriet had used, referring instead to the uppermost residential level below the mechanical floor, a phrasing that, once I mapped it against the older building's likely layout, worked out to precisely the level that would have been the 13th floor by ordinary counting. I also found, buried in a different archive entirely, a short item from 1975, the year after the current Aldermore building was completed, reporting a workplace incident during final construction. A subcontractor, who had, according to the brief, carefully neutral language of the article, sustained fatal injuries during elevator installation work, with no further detail provided about the specific circumstances. I don't know whether that incident is connected to what Harriet and I both experienced, or whether it's simply an unrelated, ordinary tragedy of the kind that occurs during any major construction project. But the timing unsettled me enough that I've never been able to fully separate it from the rest of the pattern, in the same way you can always tell, examining a scar, which specific injury actually caused it. I moved out of the Aldermore within 2 months of that conversation, telling my landlord, the same way I've already described, that it was for an unrelated job relocation. I want to close this account by telling you about the last conversation I had with Harriet before I left, because it stayed with me more than almost anything else from those final weeks. "Do you think it'll ever stop?" I asked her. "Whatever's happening on that floor. Do you think it fades eventually, the way people say some hauntings do, given enough time?" She thought about it for a long moment before answering, the same careful, deliberate pause she'd used throughout our conversation the week before. "I used to think that," she said. "I don't anymore. I think it's been nearly 90 years now, counting back to that first fire. And if anything, from everything I've pieced together talking to a small handful of other residents over the years who've experienced some version of what happened to you and me, it seems to be finding its way to the surface, more often now, not less. I don't know what that means for how much longer this building, or any building built on ground like this, can keep managing it quietly. I just know I'm glad I'm old enough now that I probably won't be the one who's still living here to find out." I told one more person the full story before I moved out. A close friend named Marcus, who worked in structural engineering and who I'd hoped, honestly, might be able to offer some grounded technical explanation that would let me set the whole experience aside as an elaborate but ultimately explainable malfunction. He listened to the entire account with the patient, faintly amused skepticism of someone humoring a friend he assumed was either exaggerating or genuinely mistaken about what he'd experienced, and he offered, at first, exactly the kind of practical explanation I'd hoped for. Elevator control systems sometimes glitch. Old buildings have wiring quirks that can produce strange temporary displays, and floor irregularities in older construction aren't unheard of even when they don't appear on official blueprints. He came with me to the building anyway, a few days later, partly out of professional curiosity and partly, I think, to reassure me, by demonstrating how ordinary and explainable the elevator's behavior actually was. We rode it together, at 11 at night, deliberately, both of us watching the panel closely, and nothing unusual happened at all. An entirely normal ride, floor 12 to floor 14. No 13th button, no lurch, no dim hallway. Exactly the outcome Marcus had expected, and exactly the outcome that left me feeling, afterward, foolish and uncertain about my own memory of that Tuesday night. We tried again the following week, at his suggestion, riding the elevator alone, separately, at various hours over several nights, cataloging nothing but ordinary, unremarkable trips, until the 4th night, when Marcus rode it by himself around 1 in the morning while I waited in the lobby, and came back down almost 8 minutes later than I'd expected. Pale, quiet, uncharacteristically slow to answer when I asked him what had taken so long. "I'm not going to do that again," he said. And he would not, despite considerable pressing on my part, describe in any detail what had actually happened during those 8 minutes, beyond a single, halting admission that he'd seen the same button I'd described, felt the same impossible cold, and had made the same choice I had, pressing the lobby button immediately, rather than stepping out to investigate further. He apologized, later that same week, for having been skeptical of my account in the first place, and he has never, in all the time since, been willing to discuss the specifics of what he actually saw in that brief dim glimpse of the 13th floor, no matter how many times I've gently asked. if you live in a building with a missing 13th floor. And if you're being honest with yourself, you probably do, because the superstition is common enough that most mid-rise buildings from a certain era share it. I would ask you to do one thing the next time you're riding that elevator alone, late at night, more tired than you'd like to be. Don't look too closely at the button panel, and if you ever do see a number appear that has never been there before, glowing, waiting for your finger to confirm what it's offering you. For your own sake, don't touch it, and don't wonder, even for a moment, what might be waiting on the other side of those doors to, finally, after all these years, greet whoever's curious enough to come find it.